Hello everybody, welcome to Snyder's Inc. And today we've got a MrBallen video, news MrBallen video with the green screen, everything going good. We got MrBallen's news video, which is we have an organ harvesting problem. We'll get right into it. Ladies and gentlemen, hit the like button, subscribe button, comments thing down below. Let's go.
Today, I'm going to tell two totally insane medical mystery stories. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So, if that's of interest to you, the next time the like button is feeling down, give them a Jack-in-the-Box toy to cheer them up. But make sure you don't give them a normal Jack-in-the-Box. Instead, give them one that's filled with angry hornets. Also, please subscribe and turn on all notifications.
That is next level evil.
So you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories.
Time again to MrBallen. I've been trying to get up to date with this thing, but every time I go to do it, I end up distracted, and I've been up doing more MrBallen videos. I'll get to it. Don't you worry.
December 2nd, 1848, a German doctor named Karl Heinrich August von Bureau was just opening up his...
That's a lot of names. Karl Heinrich August von Bureau. We'll just call him Karl Bureau for short. Karl von Bureau, that's his name.
Private medical practice in East Prussia when a teenage boy burst in through the doors looking totally frantic. Before the doctor could ask any questions, the teenager blurted out that another boy in town needed his help right now. When the doctor asked, what does the boy need? The teenager would say, well, the boy is honking like a goose. For a second, Dr. von Bureau thought this might be a joke, but then he saw the look on the teenager's face, and he could tell he was very upset and very serious. So the doctor grabbed his bag, and he ran outside with the teenager, and they hailed a horse and carriage, and they told the driver to hurry up. When Dr. von Bureau and this teenager arrived at the honking boy's house, the honking boy's mother came running outside looking totally flustered, and she flagged down the doctor and then brought him inside her house. And as she led the doctor through the home towards her son's bedroom, she explained what was going on. She said her 12-year-old son had been outside playing with his friends when suddenly he had developed this really intense coughing fit, kind of out of nowhere. And then finally, when the coughing stopped and the boy tried to breathe in, his throat made this horrible honking sound. And so her boy had come in the house honking with every breath, and so kind of in a panic, the mother had opened up her son's mouth and looked inside, but she hadn't seen anything, and she knew her son was not sick. There were no other symptoms really at all that were concerning about her son. It was...
What the heck could be happening that could cause the 12-year-old to just start honking? I'm going to put it as honking because I don't think he's actually honking. He's like almost making this weird sounds. He gasps for air. What the heck's going on? What is this poor 12-year-old, poor Professor's 12-year-old going through?
Just that he was honking. Now, for a while, the mother thought this would just kind of clear up, that maybe it was just kind of some byproduct of coughing really, really hard. But now it had been 18 hours, and the boy was still honking with nearly every breath, which is why she had finally told the teen to go get the doctor. When the mother let Dr. von Bureau into her son's bedroom and he got a look at the honking boy, he couldn't believe how terrible the boy looked. His face was all swollen and kind of bluish, and he was sweating profusely, and when the doctor...
Hold on. If this kid's 12-year-old having trouble catching his breath, like getting a breath because he's making his honking sound, probably isn't helping. How is this kid alive? 18 hours. How is this kid still alive?
Doctor watched him try to breathe in. Not only did he honk, but also very clearly this boy was really struggling just to breathe. So it was more than the sound. It looked like he was suffocating. And so the doctor rushed over to the boy and told him to open up his mouth. The boy did, and the doctor looked into his mouth, but there was nothing he could see that was blocking his airway. And so the doctor just put his finger into this boy's mouth, and he reached down inside, and suddenly he felt something lodged in the boy's throat that was small and hard, and he couldn't quite grab it. So he grabbed his forceps, which are kind of like big tweezers, and he reached back into the boy's mouth, and he tried to grab this object that was clearly obstructing his throat, but the object was too slippery and the doctor could not pull it out. And so the doctor is looking at this boy who's obviously struggling to breathe, and he's thinking to himself, if I don't get in there and get this obstruction out, this kid is going to die. And so the doctor...
This Von Bureau is just fighting there like, oh god, can't get it with the forceps, can't get the thing. How on earth does he get it out? How does he get it out here?
Made a decision right then and there to perform an emergency tracheotomy, which is a surgery where you basically cut a hole in someone's neck in order to create a hole in their throat to let air go in. But in this case, the doctor was just opening up his throat to try to get to this object. And so the doctor pulled out his scalpel and he performed the tracheotomy on this boy. He opened up his throat, and when he looked inside the hole into this boy's throat, he saw the obstruction. It was like this pink, small, hard object. And so the doctor just reached in, scooped it with his finger, and pulled it out. And right away, the boy could breathe again. He was not honking anymore. It was obvious that this fixed the problem, but the doctor and the mother are just looking at this object in the doctor's hand, having no idea how to react to this because it made no sense. The object that was trapped in this boy's throat that was making him honk like a goose was a literal goose's larynx. The larynx...
What? 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 Why was a goose's larynx even in this guy's throat? What is this kid doing with goose? What? I'm trying to process this. What? I can't think straight. How does this 12-year-old get a goose's larynx in his body? What has to happen for that to happen?
Larynx is a hollow tube in your throat that helps you make sound. In humans, we call it the voice box. And right before this boy began honking, he was playing a game with his friends that involved taking recently severed goosenecks and blowing through them like they were trumpets. And at some point, as this boy was doing it, he began to cough for some reason, and on the inhale, during one of these coughing fits, he had this gooseneck in front of his mouth, and so when he inhaled suddenly, he inhaled the goose larynx. And so that was why he sounded...
Why were you playing this game? What? It doesn't... Who thinks it like that? Whose bunch of kids just go, hey, we need to grab these severed goose necks and play them like the trumpets. That's what we need to do. That's all entertainment. I know this is back in the day, they didn't have the internet or something like that. But you couldn't think of something else? Why is that what you came up with?
Sounded like a goose. He literally had a goose's voice box in his throat. Luckily, the honking boy would make a full recovery. If you're watching this video...
That is one of the most insane things I have actually ever heard. This is without a doubt, one of the most strangest stories I have ever heard. This is a long one. But that was insane.
In the best health he had been in since leaving the service. Robert had gotten a kidney transplant a year and a half earlier, and after getting that operation, he really wanted to make sure he stayed healthy, and so he had been going on regular walks and eating healthy, and so really he was doing great. But a few days ago, Robert had noticed this throbbing pain in his right hip that was shooting pain all the way down his right leg, and he assumed, this had to be from maybe overdoing it on one of his walks. But the pain had continued to get worse and worse over the last few days, and so that was why he was finally here at the hospital. A nurse eventually called Robert's name, and so Robert, he came off the wall and hobbled over to her, and she led him down a hallway into an exam room. Once they got inside the room, the nurse would take Robert's vitals, which were all normal, and then after doing that, she said she was going to go out and get the doctor. A couple minutes later, the doctor walked into the room, and she...
Oh, I hate waiting for the doctor. I hate waiting when I have to. If I'm in an emergency, last thing I want to do is be sitting there waiting for a doctor.
Reviewed Robert's chart and talked to Robert about his symptoms, and then afterwards she concluded that very likely what Robert had was something called sciatica. Sciatica is pain caused by pressure on the sciatic nerve, which travels from the lower back down each leg. And while sciatica is definitely very uncomfortable and very painful, it's not usually a big deal, and it typically clears up on its own without treatment. And so the doctor told Robert that he should just go pick up some ibuprofen, so over-the-counter pain medication, and take that every couple of hours and just wait for this thing to pass, and then he'd be fine. And so Robert was totally relieved. He thanked the doctor, he thanked the nurse, and then he left and headed back to his home. But despite doing what the doctor said and taking pain meds and just kind of taking it easy, the pain in Robert's leg did not go away. And then on the morning of February 4th, so 3 days after Robert's trip to the ER, he woke up and not only was his right hip and leg still sore, but now when he tried to stand up, he couldn't put any weight on his right leg. It just felt too weak and it was kind of tingly. Something just felt off about it. And also Robert felt very nauseous. And so Robert told himself that, maybe what was going on here is he was taking too much ibuprofen and it was upsetting his stomach, and maybe it was also affecting his leg negatively or something. He didn't know. And so that day he just sat on the couch and watched TV trying to tell himself that he was okay. It's just sciatica, take a little less pain meds and you'll be okay. But that didn't work, because the next day when he woke up, he was in even worse shape. Now he not only had this pain and weakness in his right leg, and he had nausea still, but also he now had this new pain in his abdomen that was located right around where the scar was from his kidney transplant, and Robert was also starting to spike a fever. And fevers in transplant patients are a really big deal, because a fever in a transplant patient could mean an infection. People who get transplants are then given medication that keep their bodies from rejecting their new organ or organs. This medication works by basically suppressing that person's immune system. This prevents the body from mistakenly attacking the new organ, but it also means that if their body gets a real infection, they will have a really hard time fighting it off, because again, this medicine is basically stopping the immune system. And so when Robert saw he had a fever in conjunction with these other symptoms that were not going away, he knew he had to go back to the hospital, because obviously this was not just sciatica. Robert was too sick and weak to drive himself to the hospital, so he asked his neighbor to drive him, and as they were driving to the hospital, Robert basically sat in the passenger seat, rocking back and forth, not saying anything because he was so uncomfortable, and the neighbor, the whole time they're driving, they just kept looking over at Robert, because not only did Robert look totally miserable, but also Robert was sweating profusely, like so much so that it looked like he had just sprinted a 5K. I mean, he was...
What is going on, Robert? Is he getting because we're talking about organ harvest. Is someone taking my man's organs? Is he just getting organs taken on a consistent basis every night or something?
Was drenched in sweat. And so the neighbors looking at him thinking what's wrong with this guy?
Clearly something serious is wrong with this guy.
Finally, the neighbor arrived at the hospital, and Robert, he managed to get out on his own, and he thanked the neighbor, and then Robert hobbled his way back through the doors into the ER. And then a few minutes later, Robert was in an exam room, and his doctor walked in, and she took one look at him and saw how horrible he looked, and without any hesitation, she said, "You're getting admitted right now." It was clear to Robert's doctors that he had some kind of virus or infection that his body was trying and failing to fight off. When they tested his blood, they saw his white blood cell count was elevated, which is a sign that the body's immune system is launching some kind of a response. But the doctors didn't know what his immune system was responding to. Even though Robert had this acute pain in his abdomen around the site of the kidney transplant, his kidneys seemed to be working just fine. And so whatever was going on with him didn't seem to be linked to his transplant. The profuse sweating did seem pretty odd, but considering Robert had a really high fever, it wasn't totally inexplicable. So basically, Robert's symptoms were weird, but kind of generic. They didn't tell the doctors specifically what was wrong with him. They just knew something was wrong. So they just hooked Robert up to an IV and began administering a broad spectrum antibiotic, which is something that treats a whole variety of different infections. And then after that, the doctors just began testing Robert over and over and over again for all these different things that could be the cause for his illness. But every test they ran came back negative.
What does this guy have and he's going on with his system? Is he being poisoned? Is he getting killed? Is that what's happening here?
And at the same time, over the couple of weeks that they ran all these tests, Robert just kept getting sicker and sicker and sicker. His fever wasn't going away, he was still sweating profusely, his blood pressure was all over the map, and he had even begun drooling almost uncontrollably to the point where he didn't even speak because he was so embarrassed about it. But to the doctors, the scariest symptom that Robert was now showing 2 weeks into staying at the hospital was he was starting to act really confused. Like he didn't know where he was, he didn't know why he was there. And so that told the doctors that, whatever his body was fighting, it had made its way up into his brain. And so the doctors knew, Robert did not have much time left, but they had tried every test they could think of, and Robert had tested negative for all of them. And so, as kind of like a Hail Mary, because they had nothing to lose, the medical staff decided to just start testing Robert for basically completely random diseases that he almost certainly did not have. But basically, if any of these illnesses had a symptom that Robert had, they would test him for it. And all these tests came back negative, except for one. On February 22nd...
What? Okay, they figured out what one was. They figured out what he had. They figured it out.
So 17 days after Robert had been admitted to the hospital, this test came back positive, and when the doctors saw what he was testing positive for, they immediately assumed this has to be a mistake. There is no way he has that. However, the only way to truly confirm that diagnosis was to literally cut into Robert's brain, which would kill him. And so obviously they were not going to do that. So the doctors basically just had to take this diagnosis at face value, and they tried giving various medications to Robert, but it was obvious none of them were working. And so the doctors felt like there wasn't much they could do, and they just began focusing instead on keeping Robert comfortable. And then finally, on February 27th, so 22 days into Robert's stay at the hospital, he would die from this mystery illness.
What the hell happened to him? What happened to this guy? This is insane. What happened to Robert? What was he given?
During Robert's autopsy, the medical examiner was able to perform that test that doctors could not perform on him when he was alive, and that was to cut into his brain. And when the doctor cut into his brain, he saw very clearly, without a shadow of a doubt, that yes, Robert really was positive for that very, very rare virus, and it absolutely is the thing that killed him. But this was not the end of the case, because the virus that killed Robert was not just rare, it was also highly contagious, which meant the doctors needed to figure out how Robert got this virus to protect other people from getting it too. But the staff at this hospital knew they were not equipped to lead this investigation, and so they handed the case over to the Centers for Disease Control, or the CDC, which is the world's leading disease tracking agency. Investigators for the CDC began looking into Robert's case a couple of days later. They sifted through the days and the weeks leading up to Robert's hospitalization in an effort to try to retrace Robert's footsteps to figure out what made him sick. Now, they didn't have any leads. The only thing they agreed on was that very likely, even though Robert had that pain around his scar where the transplant was, that very likely the transplant did not have to do with whatever killed him, because Robert's kidney had been working fine and his transplant had happened 17 months earlier, and typically complications from transplants will happen much sooner. And so they basically had ruled the transplant out as being the cause. But one of the CDC investigators decided to look into the transplant file anyways, just to see if maybe something got missed, or if maybe there was some detail about the donor that was relevant to what happened to Robert. And so this investigator got the file and began going through it. Robert's donor's name was William Edward Small, and at the time of his death, he was 20 years old and serving in the Air Force. Now, none of that stood out to the CDC investigator. But William's cause of death definitely did. Even though it really did not appear to have a connection to Robert, it was just so weird and unexpected. The CDC investigator would read that back in September of 2011, William was out fishing in the Gulf of Mexico, and he caught a fish, and he ate that fish, and it gave him something called ciguatera poisoning. Ciguatera poisoning is something you get when you eat a fish that contains microalgae toxins. And so William, he ate this fish that was contaminated, and not long after that, he had died. But when the CDC investigator read through all of William's symptoms before he died, they basically exactly lined up with all of Robert's symptoms. William had developed pain and weakness in his extremities. He developed a very high fever. He became nauseous. He also lost the ability to swallow, and then he became totally confused and then died. And so when the CDC investigators saw this incredible coincidence, she knew she was onto something, but first she would need more information about William. And so very quickly, the CDC got in touch with William's family, and they asked them all these questions about William. And finally, after hearing the answers from the family, the CDC finally figured out what actually happened to Robert and what actually happened to William. It would turn out William was not just a fisherman, he was also a hunter and a trapper. And he had a very specific way he would go about training his hunting dogs. He would
I am so fascinated. I'm sorry, this is just so fascinating to me.
capture wild raccoons and use them as live bait to train his hunting dogs how to hunt. Now, William was always very cautious with these wild raccoons, but in the year and a half leading up to his death, he was bit 2 different times by raccoons. And it was one of those 2 raccoon bites, not some toxic fish in the Gulf of Mexico, that killed William and killed Robert. William did not die from ciguatera poisoning. He died from rabies, and the rabies virus that was in his kidney was still present when it was taken out of his dead body and transplanted into Robert's body. And so that was how Robert got rabies. Rabies can look like the common flu at first. People feel achy and nauseous, they get fevers, their stomach starts to hurt. Some people affected by rabies will drool uncontrollably, like Robert, or they'll lose the ability to swallow, like William. But for everybody who contracts rabies and who does not get a vaccine right away, because a vaccine does stop rabies in the early stage, so if you don't do that, everybody dies. That's what rabies does to you. It kills you. Now, you'd think, maybe we should be testing organs for rabies before they get transplanted, but you gotta remember that rabies is so rare. Only 1 or 2 people a year in the entire United States will die from rabies. And so it's just not something doctors are gonna screen for, because the percentage chance that they could have rabies is basically 0. Ultimately, Robert was not the only person who received an organ transplant from William. There were 3 other people that received his organs. Luckily, though, the CDC was able to track those 3 people down, and all of them were totally healthy and not showing any signs of rabies, so either they didn't have it or they were super early stage, which meant they were eligible for the rabies vaccine. They all got the vaccine, and they lived happily ever after.
What are the odds of this?
As promised,
What are the odds of this? What are the odds that this... Wow! This is insane. What are the odds they'd get this story, that this would happen? This guy would get a kidney from someone who had rabies and still... And he'd die while every other person who got a organ from him survived. Robert was just the unlucky one. Oh my fucking god. Ladies and gentlemen, that is it for this reaction video. Let me know what you think in the comments. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all for the next one.